Good morning, everybody. Firstly, thank you to EOI for the very kind invitation to speak today, and for everyone joining, and for tuning your ears into the version in English. Very much appreciated. So this morning, I'm going to cover opportunities and risks in carbon markets, which is no small topic. As we've seen from the previous speakers, there are many facets to this area. It's a very complicated market internationally. So I will cover this in a fairly high-level detail and try and draw together many of the topics that other speakers have covered already, and give you a comprehensive view of how things stand presently and where opportunities lie for the future. First of all, in just a quick summary about market as an organization, and the context for market being involved in the carbon market. We have been established for nearly 10 years and very extensively working in the financial sector across many what are now mature marketplaces, but in things like credit and bonds, which over the last decade have really grown significantly. And the role really of the company is to provide efficiency, transparency, infrastructure that helps participants in these markets to get more transparency, to understand what the risks are in the market that they're engaged with, and to give them better capabilities to report for regulatory and other compliance requirements. And so if you see the growth in the company, it's also following, I think, the trends in the need for more transparency, for greater price visibility, to know who counterparties are and what they're doing. And so consequently, environmental markets are very early in their growth, but ultimately they need all of these tools over time. Our client base today is very much the traditional financial community, but from that you can see great parallels with the carbon markets, because many of the actors in the carbon markets will be the same institutions that are actors in the main financial markets. We've been recognized for some of the work that we've done over the years. There's a few awards that we've been given, and if you want to have a look at more detail, then the website has more information about the company. So really on to where we are today in the carbon markets. And given the significant change that this industry has experienced over the years that it's been established, it makes sense to draw a line as to where today I'm going to focus on, because the situation today is very different to that which was expected pre-Copenhagen. In the time between Copenhagen and Cancun, things changed again. And then since Cancun, the situation is different. This is because, I suppose, the only constant in this market is change. It is a very rapidly evolving arena. Lots of actors, people with very different motivations for being in the space. You have complex geopolitical discussions. You have local and large economic drivers. You obviously have private sector involvement, from institutional investors through to large organizations and global brands. Additionally, you have the actions of NGOs and other charitable organizations. So when you put all of these things together, it makes for a very complicated landscape. And so it makes sense, in order to try and show you where we see the opportunities and future risks, to say, well, it's from this point today that we're moving forward, because it's not appropriate to say you forget everything that's gone before, but certainly the previous expectations have evolved considerably. So much of this is a recap, but for the purposes of just showing you how the situation today is ultimately a healthy one. It's not correct, I think, to say that there is a global carbon market. There are international efforts, there are regional markets, there is a range of compliance markets, the largest of which is the EU ETS, And then every other sort of compliance market is ultimately a very small microcosm. So activities in New Zealand, you have activities in the US under the REGI mechanism, and in New South Wales and Australia. That does not make an international global carbon market. So there's quite a long way to go until we have that. But inherently, today you have a very stable platform from which to grow a carbon market. Additionally, as covered yesterday, voluntary markets are a key piece of this, largely for innovation and for driving participation amongst large corporations. And that is a space which has huge potential as well, but for many reasons. We've looked at data, so I won't go through this in detail. But really, this is it's taking the report, I think, that Grattan used yesterday from the Ecosystem Marketplace New Energy Finance report, which is one of the only ways to see a comparison of all of the global markets between the voluntary and all of the compliance markets that exist today. The reason I put this in here is to highlight by volume of carbon and by value in dollars that this is already a fairly mature market. But it is concentrated in so few areas that we need to take this experience in order to really evolve this into a global market that can engage and deliver the kind of environmental results that the markets were conceived for. So in terms of outcomes from Cancun, and again this will set the agenda for where opportunities and risks lie, there are several key things from Cancun, some expected, some unexpected, which really underpin the opportunities that we will have. RED, I think, is probably top of the agenda simply because it was the most concrete outcome. It was the one that gained most momentum. It gained most commitment from various countries and from the broader private sector as well. And so essentially, the agreement was that countries will prepare for RED, that they will look at implementing it, in putting in place the mechanisms to implement it, and that they will look at how they can deliver results-based payment for the performance of RED. And I think that's a very important foundation because now it gives people a sort of certainty around what they can start to build their activities upon. This also actually includes a global goal for avoiding deforestation. Essentially, deforestation, according to the World Bank, accounts for about 20% of all emissions. And thus far, it's not included in any of the mechanisms that exist for carbon markets. There are no targets, there are no compliance markets which allow for RED, and yet it's one of the biggest causes of emissions internationally, right up there with transport and other sectors. And so the key decision that's yet to be made is exactly how markets will finance this initiative, but there is a decision that says that in Durban at the end of this year there will be a discussion around it in more detail, and they will expect to actually discuss and finalize the way in which this will be financed. You have advisory groups who will be there to decide on the monitoring and methodologies behind it, and this has got a target of achieving this in the next couple of years. There's also going to be a huge focus on socio-economic and the rights of indigenous peoples. I think one of the big criticisms of the global markets thus far has been that if you look at the ETS, it largely is focused on European nations, and it does not necessarily cater for the social and the local economy scenarios in the countries which the projects are being developed. And given the importance of forestry, people have sort of a feeling of connection with forests and the land. There's been a huge effort to ensure that the rights of indigenous people, that there is a sustainable both social and economic element here, are catered for in the way that the discussions progress. And again on this, we're looking at how the financing of RED will actually be tied to the ability for those projects to deliver those social safeguards. So it's not just a simple, we give you money, you do what you want, we get credits, and no one worries about the details on the ground. There's a real focus on making sure that this is something that is established for the benefit of the people. Another huge outcome for Cancun was climate finance. One of the big questions over many years has been, where will the money come from to pay for this? And what are the roles and responsibilities of the developed nations versus the developing nations? And even by that sort of split, you still have many layers of developing nations. People still under the official protocol of the COP and the UNFCCC process, China, India, Brazil are developing nations. Yet comparative to many nations in other parts of Asia and Africa, they are far more developed. And so, as we saw yesterday, most of the benefits of the CDM to date have really gone to those more developed developing nations, as opposed to the less developed developing nations. And so the establishment of a green climate fund is a very important tool by which you will get, hopefully, more sort of egalitarian disbursement of funds, a much more focused way of ensuring that the money that is committed arrives in the right places. The headline number, which everyone has concentrated on, is $100 billion per annum of funding by the year 2020, which sounds like a big number, and I'll come back to that later. The other thing which was committed to was the reaffirmation of the Copenhagen Accord. So we all know very little happened at Copenhagen. There was nothing that was particularly positive as a result, but there was the Copenhagen Accord. The hope was that that would be ratified, agreed in Cancun. It was not, but they confirmed that they will commit to delivering on Fast Start finance as part of that accord in the next 3 years. So that's one part of the accord which has had some progress since Copenhagen. The other element is that there will be a committee for the Global Carbon Fund to activate long-term financing. How do you go from where you are today to $100 billion per annum? It's a big jump, because funding today comparatively is very little. So there are now some discussions, albeit postponed until Durban, that will look at how you get from where we are today to a long-term sustainable funding mechanism for these activities. Beyond this, we've started to get some important activities around monitoring, reporting, verification. And again, these start to have important things when it comes to opportunities and risks, because essentially for carbon markets to work, you need data, you need transparency, you need the ability to know what is your baseline, where are you starting from, what are the targets, and each step, how are you going to achieve that, and to monitor your progress against those targets. So this commitment was very important. One of the key elements of this really was the concession made between the US and China. Historically, they have been very reticent to agree on much, and in this situation it was actually India that arbitrated and proposed a compromise that got the agreement from both the US and China to actively commit to how they would become more transparent and accountable for their emissions. And that will have a cascade effect, because the big sticking point for most other countries was the fact that the two largest emitters would not agree to provide transparency and accountability. So hopefully, this paves the way for many opportunities as a result. NAMAs at the bottom, so national appropriate mitigating actions, are still the responsibility of each country to develop. So they're still vague. There is still no certain formula for how a country will do this, but there is a key link to the ability to monitor. So if countries make the commitment to monitor, they will then make the commitment to implement their own NAMAs, and from there you can then start to look at carbon market mechanisms with more certainty and in more seriousness. And then one of the huge surprises or controversies from the Cancun discussions really relates to the future of the Kyoto Protocol. There is still no commitment to a second phase once 2012 finishes. There is a concession or an agreement in principle that people will target 25 to 40% reductions by 2020, but they haven't yet agreed that finally. So they've agreed that they will agree on something. So you have more discussion. Japan and Russia really shook the whole event, because they said that they would not sign up for any post-2012 commitments. And certainly they said without the US making any obligations themselves. So for those who are familiar with the Kyoto Protocol, it was ratified by many countries globally, most that participate in the UNFCCC discussions. A very notable exception was the US. And that remains the case. And it is a big point of contention, because if the number one, or was the number one emitter when all of these discussions began, will not commit, then why should anyone else? So this is an interesting scenario which is still progressing. And again, things were deferred until Durban. So we have to wait to see what will happen. But one of the other elements that came from this is, well, if there is no commitment for a period post-2012 and through till 2020, can the CDM continue? So we've seen all of the data and information about the Clean Development Mechanism over the last 2 days. You know, huge money involved, huge investment, huge number of projects, and now the very continuation of that is being questioned. So this is an interesting situation, and we'll have to see how this plays into future evolutions of the market. And then the final part here, what were the key targets that were set or agreed that would be discussed? So again, no formal reduction commitments made according to or aligned to the Copenhagen Accord, but nonetheless, a commitment to continue talking, and that it is important that they do something for the second commitment period, and that there is a more long-term plan to reach targets for 2050. Beyond that, everyone confirmed that 2 degrees is the key number. We need to try and limit emissions below. A lot of pressure from very small island states, countries like the Maldives, who would like that to be increased, or the target to be more challenging, and the number to be reduced to 1.5 degrees. And that has now... and then finally, the need for peaking emissions. So it's accepted that certain countries' emissions will grow. They're developing countries. The key is, when will they peak? So if you look at China, China currently expects its emission growth to peak in 2030, roughly. But what impact does that have between now and 2030? You know, how big will China's emissions be? And what will they have done to already reduce the amount that they will end up producing annually versus, you know, if they don't take action already now, what will the total be in 2030 compared to that if they're already making actions? It's a very complicated analysis that's being made, but the idea is that they would like this year to try and work towards consensus on a date where global emissions will peak. Again, a very challenging discussion topic. So where does this lead us to? So now that we know what the landscape is, we have an understanding of some of the key foundations that people are working forwards from for this year and beyond. There's an ability for people, for participants in these markets, to start focusing on key opportunities. So I'm going to run through many of these. Some will be familiar, others will be perhaps a new concept, but I'm going to try and get into some of the detail that will hopefully identify why they're opportunities, and the types of actors that will be able to take advantage of these opportunities. So red, we already know there's huge emissions that are caused by deforestation. In reality, the big challenge is that the developed world has already eradicated most of its forest. So, you know, there's not much of an action for them per se. And it's typically less developed countries that have the stockpile of indigenous native forest, mainly in the subtropical regions, that has a huge wealth of natural resource potential, biodiversity. So I think something like 20% of the land mass of the world is forested. About 80% of the world's biodiversity lives in the forests. So again, you have many reasons why forestry is such a hot topic. Partly because the consensus is that we cannot continue to destroy the rainforest because of the natural balancing it makes in the global ecosystem and the prevailing climate. That's before you get to the emissions that would be produced from the deforestation, the preservation of biodiversity, and behind all of this, when most of these assets or forests are held in developing countries, this is a source of income for them. They've been exploiting it. They say it's their right to exploit the forest in the way that the developed world exploited their forest before they removed most of it. And so they believe that if they're going to preserve the forest, they need to be incentivized to do so. There need to be alternative, sustainable mechanisms for them to be able to generate income, revenue, to put in place frameworks that allow their local indigenous populations, their local communities to have a means of generating and surviving. You know, essentially, the argument is simple. If the only way you put food on the table is by going out, chopping down trees for either charcoal or for grazing or for something else, and someone says, well, stop, and they offer you no alternative, and you can no longer put food on the table, why would you? So it's a very simple balance of human needs at a basic level and the pressures that the developing or the developed world puts on the developing world to mitigate this. There's also a change in mentality. The developing countries recognize now that they have an opportunity to be sustainable. They recognize that perhaps in the long term, not destroying the forest is actually a better way for them as countries to evolve economically. There are many other types of revenues that they can develop from this. So, you know, the creation of methodologies under carbon accounting that allow for you know, emission reductions to be generated, which is something that was covered extensively yesterday. Well, the fact there are now these methodologies gives people the expectation that they can preserve the forest, they can generate a significant income stream from credits generated, but additionally there are other ancillary revenue streams they can have. You have local ecotourism. You can employ people to preserve the boundary of the rainforest, to do all the monitoring on the basis that the revenue from the credits feeds into the overall project. And then you will have other sustainable commodities that can be produced, everything from rattan to biofuel, biomass, you know, etc. And the idea is to underpin a whole market which is based on the downtake from forests. You have lots of participation from lots of types of organizations. And again, RED, in a way, is a microcosm of the global challenges that the whole climate debate has. You have an international framework that the United Nations and 193 countries are trying to agree to say, yes, RED has a place, there is a mechanism, there is funding, there is governance, and there are responsibilities for all of these participants. So it's a very top-down approach. But getting all of these countries to agree, agreeing the language, agreeing the governance mechanism, rolling it out to all of the countries, yeah, there's a role to play. It's a big opportunity. You then have national schemes. You have these countries which themselves have these huge areas of forest. They now have the opportunity to establish their own schemes that look at RED. So they can look at how they develop baseline information. They can look at how they would like local governance of forests to be implemented. They can then look at they are responsible for allocating funds, you know, making sure that they're working with companies which are native to the countries, to engaging with organizations that they can govern in terms of how they approach this, ensuring that they follow the process in the right way, and they take responsibility for their own assets, for their own opportunity to explore the potential in RED. You then have subnational schemes. So below this, at a state or a regional level, you know, we know that governance and political leadership is devolved into different levels. You have national, subnational, and so the subnational arenas would also like their own ability to control what happens in their states. I think it comes down to an identity element. We all know and like to retain our local identity. So, it's very clear, and I'll be controversial even in Spain, the identity of people from this region versus, the Catalan region, that people have their own ideas of identity. And so at a subnational level, the opportunity is for these local states to implement the mechanisms in harmony with the national schemes and with the international schemes, but to really be optimized for their own area. And then you have a role for the private sector. Governments always have a role to play in terms of setting the agenda, putting in place a framework, incentivizing, but they're not always the best at rolling these things out in scale for making it something that will grow and reach its full potential. So the private sector, both from institutional investors, organizations, NGOs, they have an essential role to play in this. They have huge opportunities around funding, project development, around continuing innovation and market stimulation. Without this kind of participation, then RED will have even greater challenges. So there's a huge opportunity for organizations that understand this area to get involved immediately. Around this, you then have some interesting evolutions around bilateral agreements. You have countries like Norway, which have huge sovereign wealth funds, investing $1 billion in both Guyana and Indonesia, saying, protect your forests. Here's $1 billion. There are some caveats, there are some criteria that you have to meet, but essentially, you're already seeing huge sums of money being given to countries in order to preserve these assets. So if that is an indicator of the potential, I think it shows this is a huge opportunity. And finally, the combination of compliance and voluntary markets. In the way that was covered yesterday, you now have on-the-ground mechanisms and methodologies by which you can define your carbon asset, which can then plug into a carbon market. The problem you have today is that the voluntary market has defined the methodology. The compliance market has not yet completed the framework and said what's eligible within the framework. So there's an opportunity for these two to work together because they have two complementing pieces of the overall picture. So that's something where I think over the course of the next few years we'll see an increasing ascension of voluntary market mechanisms into compliance markets mechanisms as well. So moving on from RED, technology. Where to begin? This is, again, a huge area. And so I'll touch on key things, but try and give you a sense of how this is evolving rapidly. So perhaps something to state up front. China is the largest location for investment in clean tech investment. Globally, they receive more funding in the innovation around technology for the clean economy than anywhere else. They've eclipsed the US, although the US was a key incubator for many of these things. And so already this is a huge opportunity. The billions of dollars invested in this space already are vast. I saw some analysis which came from HSBC. They looked at listed companies globally. They looked at analyzing of those companies, the ones that gained at least 10% of their revenue from clean tech, and they looked at what the market capitalization would be of those companies. Given that the Stern report that was written, I think 5 years ago in the UK, said that by 2020 the clean tech economy would be worth $500 billion. HSBC was quite surprised to find, and this is data that's almost 2 years old, that it was already worth, under that approach, $560 billion. So it's already a huge economy. It's not a stated economy because it's not like you look at defense or aviation, which have their own categorizations when you go and look at share values. But nonetheless, if you look at it as a trend, it's already very well established. In fact, it eclipses many of the well-established economic categories. So renewable energy, I mean, we all know that renewable energy is increasing. You see the evidence everywhere. Germany, Spain, and Europe are leaders. There's a huge amount of investment into renewable energy via the CDM into developing countries. But the key opportunities really are in how can Wind continue to be rolled out. Certainly at the moment it has depended largely on the availability of funding and the availability of credits to be generated or feed-in tariffs. Solar is potentially the most scalable of all of the renewable technologies. And the rate of evolution in the technology is very rapid. I mean, it is evolving generation to generation very quickly. In fact, solar as an area to invest is very difficult to get right, because by the time you've invested in one early stage technology company, and seen some maturing and some revenue coming in, the next generation of technology has already been developed and is coming through. So it's moving so rapidly, actually, that the opportunity is there. It's very difficult to get right, but nonetheless it's growing. The essential thing with solar, though, is price parity. At the moment, it is quite expensive. And until that cost is reduced significantly, then the opportunity will not be fully realized. And that is one of the challenges and the areas of focus that everyone is looking at now, is how you can bring the price down. Hydropower, this has significant potential more in small-scale generation. If you look at large-scale hydroelectric dams, particularly, firstly, there are lots of debates around the actual environmental, potentially detrimental environmental impact that they have in the locations that they've already been established. It's really ongoing analysis to see what that may be. And additionally, there are actually very few locations globally where you could put any more large-scale hydropower stations in place. So this combination means that the move towards small-scale generation in rivers and other waterways is an important step. And I think we'll see a large growth in small-scale generation. And then wave technology, it's there. There's a huge amount of R&D into this, but it's a long way from being a mature technology that will really roll out. But there are opportunities there. Energy efficiency, and I think this is one of the top line elements that people will be focusing on in the next few years. Several reasons. One, in theory, it's fairly straightforward to be more energy efficient at a very rudimentary level. The simple stuff that we all get told about, but very rarely do: switch our lights off, turn off computers, etc. But now there's also a great driver for business, particularly, who is, industry is one of the largest consumers of power, and actually, it's a direct cost to the business. We're in the middle of the end, depending on where you look at it, but a huge economic downturn. Money matters. The bottom line for businesses is very important. Energy efficiency is a means of actually primarily saving money. And if you go to any CFO in any organization and tell them, well, look, here is an ROI model that says in a year, 2 years, you can save potentially millions of dollars by investing a certain amount up front, business will take that. Not necessarily because they're passionate about environmental considerations, but because they're passionate about preserving their bottom line and giving shareholder value. So energy efficiency is a very, very powerful tool to both drive the environmental agenda, but also, I think, to engage with business. And this is something which will increase over time. And there are different types. You can see some numbers. RWE has some fairly aggressive targets on reducing its tons per megawatt hour of carbon. Interestingly, they're quite happy to admit that the main reason that they have this target is because of the EU ETS. Because the cost potentially to them by 2020 of paying for allowances and CERs is going to be so huge that actually it's not affordable for them as a business. So they have to become more efficient now. Otherwise, the business from a risk management perspective, a financial risk management perspective, will become very vulnerable. And then increasingly, we're seeing this approach adopted by governments, municipalities, simply because, again, they have large installations. Government institutions employ many people, they have many offices, many installations. Again, energy efficiency is a straightforward way for them to do it. Also, governments are setting the example for people to follow. So if they're not doing what they prescribe, then why should anyone else? So again, there are some distinct opportunities. I think, again, back to almost the same agenda for business. Ultimately, they want to save money too, because most governments, and especially if you look around Europe at the moment, they don't have a lot in the bank. So, there's key drivers there. So moving on, smart grid. So this is something which I think is more relevant for, well, it will be relevant in developing countries, but is a huge initiative in developed countries, particularly in Europe and the US. If you look at that, Goldman Sachs estimates $187 billion of investment potentially in effectively smart grid technology by over the next 30 years. I think it could even be more than that. Essentially, we need to be able to move power and get power on demand. Already you see shortages in power in various places. There are different rationales for that, but we have an aging infrastructure. We have a fairly unsophisticated infrastructure in relation to some of the technology coming through. So there's now huge opportunity to invest in this. So you see very large infrastructure investment funds which are looking at the long return on investing in European infrastructure, as well as global infrastructure in the smart grid technology. I think storage is another key element here. The big problem we have at the moment are peak loads. So what happens is, it's halftime in a big football match, everyone goes, starts making coffee or something, suddenly there's a huge power surge. You have to turn 2-3 power stations on. That's when they're most inefficient, they produce more emissions. So if you can soften that curve, if you can find a way of having power either stored or to be able to bring it from different areas, then suddenly you have fewer spikes. And the softer that curve becomes, the less likely that you will have outages, the less likely that you will have to have such high capacity in the grid as well. A big debate is around the future energy mix. And this has opportunities around it, and as we'll see later, it certainly has potential risks. Where do all of these things fit together? Nuclear is an interesting one, and I put it in there because whilst it's very contentious, we may have to accept it for some point in the future, because essentially most of the major sources of energy today are either limited in capacity or have a finite lifetime, and the development of renewables and the deployment of renewables has not perhaps yet reached a level whereby you will have the capacity when coal-fired and existing nuclear stations switch off. So that's a very interesting debate. And then CCS, I give it 2 lines. This is a whole industry in itself. Fundamentally, can we capture carbon at the point of generating emissions? If we can, then coal suddenly becomes a much more environmentally friendly opportunity, and perhaps the fact that we have an abundance of coal, that it's quite cheap, perhaps that is actually the right way forward. But until then, it's one of the largest polluters. So, the question of can you sequester carbon safely, ad infinitum, big debate. Hard to know, but lots of opportunity. Waste management, agricultural technology. So recycling, very simply. Everything from food waste to industrial waste to outputs, carbon, other gases, methane, etc. We heard of various ways in which methane can be captured and used for power generation. There's going to be a huge growth in this as an area. Recycling of materials, whether it's plastics. I think the latest Mini Cooper has plastics which are sourced from a company that specializes in recycling coat hangers, fridges, plastics taken out of old vehicles. And the embedded carbon within that plastic is 25% of that of new oil-based plastics. So already you have a 75% reduction. It's a recycling, but it's better than producing it new. So there's opportunities like this which are there to be exploited. Agricultural technology, again, huge. Countries like China, India, Brazil are going to be very focused on this, the US as well. You can firstly reduce emissions in the way that you do things, perhaps using fewer pesticides and fertilizers. Increases in productivity can be derived as well. And perhaps if you get agricultural land use or agricultural technology sophisticated enough, you can stop the change in land use. At the moment, if you look at the deforestation scenario, a lot of that's driven by the need for more agricultural land or grazing land, etc. So this is a very big opportunity where you have direct positive impacts and then you have knock-on impacts as well. Finance. again, a huge area, but we'll run through this. So governments have a huge role to play. Institutional investors can all participate. Over the years, you've seen that finance has led to incentivize, and then the financial institutions have followed. So all types of financial institutions are now increasingly interested in this space. Historically, pension funds, asset managers have not necessarily had green investment strategies, but now you're starting to see an influx of especially high net worth individuals and family offices and sovereign wealth funds, because they realize that sustainability is a key element of the future securitization of their own wealth and effectively the global economy around it. You have all of the big intergovernmental development agencies. The World Bank and the IFC are sort of the global representative, but then you have lots of smaller regional ones, and some of these have as much money as the World Bank. The Brazilian Development Bank is almost as cash rich as the World Bank, which is a fascinating statistic. So they're actually involved in every infrastructure project in Brazil. If you want to get it approved, more or less, you have to try and you want funding from BNDES, you have to show that you have an element of sustainability contained within that. And this is increasingly a criteria that they're looking at as part of their decision making around funding. So the combination of these public-private funding sources are going to come back to that $100 billion per annum by 2020. The reality is, $100 billion, of course, is a huge sum of money, but spread so thinly across so many countries, in reality, it's not that much. And so private sector funding has to be evolved and given, and there needs to be mechanisms that involve private sector funding in order to get to the point where you will be able to sustain all of the investment that's needed. And then you get the types of structure of funding that will be made available. Loans and structured debt, this is already in place. Most large investment banks essentially investment banks will have ways of showing that debt will be linked either to carbon credits or feed-in tariffs, and as I said with BNDES, contingent on you having environmental focus. Trading activity, we all know that there's a buoyant, I say buoyant, it has been a very buoyant EU ETS. It's had some ups and downs, but fundamentally trading is a very good mechanism to stimulate participation. It's also a big opportunity. The current price of carbon, as we saw in the ETS, is €14 or below. It's estimated in the next 18 to 24 months, it will be up to €20 per ton and beyond. So already there's a huge increase in the price of carbon. If you're a trader institutionally, maybe that's an opportunity. Case in point, ArcelorMittal, and this is both good and bad. ArcelorMittal quoted as part of their annual statement that they made €140 million trading CERs and EUAs that added to their bottom line. Now it's bad because technically speaking that means that they had a surplus which they've sold, or maybe they've been very smart with their trading strategy, but it's good because it shows there's opportunity. Now, what you need is obviously the right caps to be put in place in order to make sure that big emitters like ArcelorMittal are not necessarily the ones making big profits from this. But you can see how trading will stimulate participation, investment, etc. So it's got a big role to play, as well as the creation of other instruments, futures options, structured instruments, swaps, etc. And then green bonds is very interesting. Up until now, the bonds market is recognized as a very strong way of engaging both institutionally, with long-term investors, pension funds, asset managers, etc., but also with individuals. Historically, they've not been very good at showing an element of sustainability within that, but there is now enough, I think, momentum to show that they're evolving. There are government green or climate banks which are being created, which will underwrite green bonds. There are municipalities that are looking at whether they can underwrite bonds based on their energy efficiency gains, because of the cost savings. Forestry is a huge topic. Forest bonds are perceived to be potentially a huge opportunity as well, where you can minimize risk by effectively looking at a portfolio of forestry projects where they'll obviously have income streams, not just carbon, and you'll underwrite a bond against that, and other project activities. Corporate activity. So corporations have a huge role to play in all of this, as I mentioned. you can start investing and acting in sustainability immediately. Some for pre-compliance, some because they see this as a huge branding and a differentiation exercise. I'm sure from a consumer engagement perspective, you will all have seen advertisements that show the ecological benefits of a product or a service in some description. So there are opportunities for business already. Some of this will link straight back to carbon markets, into the purchase of credits. Some it will lead to future participation in the carbon markets because their sectors will be regulated. Transport, aviation at the bottom, a prime example. Emerging markets. So again, this backdrop is about how actors will participate, but then you need the frameworks in which they'll engage. So there are huge numbers of schemes evolving globally. We have the ETS, which is obviously a very well-established and comprehensive mechanism, but there are those evolving elsewhere. Some key countries I've put up there. China is one that I actually, as an oversight, not to put up, but China has said as part of its next 5-year commitment plan that it will implement carbon markets domestically. That's a huge change. Historically, China has taken advantage of our carbon markets. They've made money from investment into China via the CDM. Now they're saying, can we actually activate a local domestic market where Chinese organizations and individuals participate? That's a huge step. It's much more commitment than the US has made, and I think when we get back to the debate that will come again in Durban, this will be another reason why China is going to be pushing the agenda to the US. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this dynamic shifts over time. One interesting element there is the Governor's Climate Forestry Task Force, also called the GCF, unlike the Global Climate Fund. But this essentially is a commitment from several states internationally to put forestry as a key mechanism for them to preserve their regional forest and to plug them into carbon markets. You have a signed agreement between the state of Acre in Brazil and the state of California in the US, which is the first acknowledgement of red credits being eligible in a mechanism. So credits generated in Acre will go straight into the California cap and trade mechanism when that's live. So that, I think, is a key indicator of how this will all evolve over time. And again, technology, finance, all of these elements that we've covered will have to come into play. So risks. So the first one is time. And the reason I say time is because, all of this activity has a purpose. Are we going to reach the objective in time? There's a huge amount of political decision making that takes a great deal of debate back and forth. It's very time consuming, it's very slow. But we, underlying that, have a situation which is continuing to worsen. Do we have enough time for those two elements to come together? So I think a key risk is that everything takes too long, which is why I think there's a real timing element now, an opportunity for the private sector, for institutional investors, for organizations to actually aggressively push forward with this agenda. Because while governments sort out the high-level stuff, people can still be acting now. There's enough opportunity to warrant the participation in these markets from organizations, consumers, corporations everywhere. Political uncertainty. We already highlighted the scenario left by Cancun around, will the Kyoto Treaty continue? What the structure of the CDM will be? All these kind of things. So these are all questions. Will the money for the Global Climate Fund actually arrive? And if so, where from? These kind of questions. So these are inherent risks to be aware of. There's risks on technology. Will renewable energy be scalable enough? Will it come in time? Will it be of a low enough price? Can the private sector get involved now? Do they have the risk appetite? Do they have the understanding, the knowledge, the expertise to get involved today? And can you engage with consumers? Ultimately, if you look at this whole agenda, it takes more than just corporate or governmental participation. They need to find ways of engaging with you and I at an individual level. Countries like China and India have huge growing middle classes, hundreds of millions of people. If you can capture them now as they start to become consumers, then that may have a huge opportunity for directly linking that to mitigating activity. So these are all things which at the moment are risks, but they inherently have some opportunity. Socioeconomic, do we deliver the kind of opportunities, projects that actually help the countries in which forests are being preserved or projects are being developed? Do we target the less developing countries? Do they have the engagement and the access to the capital and the support, the expertise that they need? So these are all things which are needed, because if they don't have it that way, then there's only a certain number of countries that will actually benefit from this. Microfinance potentially has a role in this as well. There's a lot of initiative around microfinance as a community engagement model, and also a way of bypassing potentially risky or corrupt political mechanisms where money goes in at the top and never goes to the bottom. And then governance. Anyone who follows the ETS sees that there's big challenges at the moment. There are question marks over how it's being run, the technology, the infrastructure, decision making, the CDM executive board, changing the criteria, deciding whether HFC gas projects are eligible or are not, whether wind projects are eligible or are not, these kind of things. So, it's understandable given that this is an evolving and emerging market, but essentially, you need some stability. You need some continuity in governance to make sure that people know where they are. And this leads to my final point, confidence. Do people actually believe in the objectives that these markets set out to achieve? Or is it just a financial gain? Do we recognize the problem at the end is, the planet is in potential jeopardy? Whatever the debate back and forth about the science or the rest of it, do people believe in that enough to participate in carbon markets? And do the carbon markets themselves have the capacity, the framework, the structure to support the participation of all of those different people and all of those different factors which are evolving at the moment? So these are key risks, but ones that collectively there's an opportunity to take on board and I think overcome. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassen. We'll take some questions. Here we have.
Hi, Hassen. Very nice presentation indeed. I just think that it would be very interesting for the floor to know what you think is going to happen or is not going to happen in Durban and maybe beyond.
Interesting.
Guessing, I guess.
A lot of guessing. So don't hold me to any of this. I think I alluded in the presentation. I think China will continue to be a very significant contributor. I think actually, they have surprised many people in that whilst they may not have directly agreed to commitments in the way that every other country has, they've certainly agreed to take action. And I think that the action that they implement over the coming year will set them up very nicely to drive the agenda with the US. I think the involvement of the US is critical, but it will take a lot of persuasion and perhaps a lot of diplomacy, to how the Chinese would do it, to do that. I think you'll start to see some agreement on what aspects of RED will be included in the CDM and other international frameworks as they emerge. I think it's seen as a vital component, so they will agree on that because there's a lot of momentum there and there's a lot of consensus amongst countries on how important this is and how it should be deployed. I'm not convinced you'll see an agreement on the second commitment phase of Kyoto. I think there'll be much debate on that. I think you'll see a continuing agreement to try and reach an agreement, with maybe some progress on the frame of how that will be. And I think you'll see a confirmation that the CDM will continue until 2020, perhaps not to the level of detail that people would like in respect of project-based or sectoral crediting or nested projects. But I think it will continue largely because the ETS is now ratified in law to continue until 2020. And so if you don't have the source of project-based credits coming in, then that really undermines the whole principle of the ETS. So I think that will be one of the main drivers.
Interesting. Any further question? I myself would like to raise a question. Which one of the red schemes that you have presented do you believe most? I mean, national level, regional level, private sector, which do you think of them will be the main driver of the red system?
I think it will be bottom up. I think it will be a combination of subnational and national working together with private sector involvement. And we see evidence of this already. So the Governor's Climate and Forestry Task Force have already in principle endorsed the VCS methodologies because they're available, and many projects are already underway in Brazil, in various parts of Brazil and Indonesia and other countries in Africa. So the on-the-ground mechanisms are in place. Additionally, at a state and a national level, certainly in Brazil, the discussion around implementing a local market is well established. In fact, there is legislation in Brazil that says there is essentially a mechanism for cap and trade and for local state-driven actions to be eligible into Congress-led national actions. So I think that will formulate a market like this. And so I think that will then contribute to shaping the agenda at the international level. Because there will be a nucleus of essentially countries which hold the assets, who by working collaboratively will have a much greater influence at the table.
Interesting.